Welcome to the Organ Podcast from the Royal College of Organists with me, Mark O'Brien. Coming up, I get down to some serious business over the organ reform movement with William McVicker.
Schweitzer believed that they'd taken a wrong turn. And what he said was, the moment has come when we cannot leave these decisions anymore to organ builders. We have to interfere somehow in the process.
That can't have gone down well.
Well, I can imagine asking that question of Andrew Caskey at Nicholson's or Andy Scott at Harrison and Harrison and getting a pretty sharp thump.
I can imagine the reply. And I also talked to Ben Bloor, organist at the London Oratory, about his experience of using social media as a tool to engage with audiences and to reflect on the wider impact social media may be having on the culture and direction of organ playing more generally.
A lot of recitals nowadays where it's just solely based on film music and music that's not specifically written for the organ. And I just wonder if we're going down a road where people are a little bit embarrassed about amazing, legacy of organ music from Bach to Messiaen and everything in between, and it's sort of been moved out of the way for what's popular at the time. You may well say, oh, well, it's attracting new audiences and people are taking up the organ on account of that, but really, are these newcomers wanting to play the organ or are they wanting to play the theme from Shrek?
It enabled a new style of playing, transformed the approach to organ building, brought new possibilities to composers, but also inflicted damage to many romantic organs and fuelled heated arguments over the authenticity of historically informed performance. It is, of course, the organ reform movement. Well, to try and fully understand the purpose of this movement, I went along to see William McVicker, one of the country's leading organ historians and consultants, at the console of a 1960s German-inspired reform organ at the Servite Church of Our Lady of Dolours on the very busy Fulham Road in London.
Well, the organ reform movement is known by several words. Sometimes the reform movement, sometimes the organ reform, but also the Orgelbewegung in Germany, and that's really where it started. It didn't arrive in England until after the Second World War. Its first sort of major appearance was at the Royal Festival Hall, which was completed in 1954. The big Harrison organ, built really to the specification of Ralph Downes, who was a great reformer. The Downes story is perhaps a separate issue to this just here, but you asked about the organ reform itself. That began with Albert Schweitzer. Now, in 1906, he published a document about organ building with some observations, and he believed that the organ had taken a wrong turn somewhere. And I think he said something like, why is it that we have managed to get to a situation where a new organ, I presume he was making reference to the big organs of Walker or Sauer, looked like the central signal box of a railway station, only seemed to last 10 years, and yet we've still got these amazing organs from the 16th and 17th, 18th century, which are still working. Why is it that the modern organ doesn't have the longevity of the old organ? There was more to it than that. He was also interested in the sound of the organ. He felt that when you played a Bach fugue on these modern organs, and we're talking about 1900 or so, German organs of that period, that the music was a muddle. And he wanted to investigate why that was the case.
But he's looking backwards. I mean, am I right in thinking he's not sort of reforming, he's trying to restore to what he thought was a Baroque sort of sound? He was going for clarity in his own particular design.
Yes and no, but that was his first foray really into this, writing this paper. He then sent a questionnaire out, which he collated in 1909, having written to lots of organ builders around Europe and asked them some really penetrating questions about the way in which they built organs. So he wanted to know, when you build an organ, how do you decide your wind pressure? How do you decide what the scales of the pipes are? How do you decide how the chorus structures are put together? How do you decide what key action it has? And he was particularly interested in the fact that there had been a sort of revolution in organ pipe scaling, that is to say the relationship of the diameter of the pipe to the length and the progression through which the pipes halve their diameter. And Schweitzer believed that they'd taken a wrong turn. And what he said was, he thought that when he collated all of these responses from organ builders, I think he said something like, the moment has come when we cannot leave these decisions anymore to organ builders. We have to interfere somehow in the process.
That can't have gone down well.
Well, I can imagine asking that question of Andrew Caskey at Nicholson's or Andy Scott at Harrison and Harrison and getting a pretty sharp thump.
I can imagine the reply. Yeah.
Yes, because, the idea of interfering in the process of organ building by an external agency was quite foreign. Organ builders are sort of used to sort of ploughing their own furrow.
But what I don't understand is, because my understanding of the organ reform movement, people wanted to think they were going back to how Baroque, the music of Bach, that kind of period of music should be played and how it sounded. Presumably, the experts at the time, Silbermann, Upschnitger, hadn't they worked out their own scaling? Wasn't that the sound that worked? That's what Bach would have heard. Why is Schweitzer and his friends thinking that they know better?
Well, you're asking actually a very deeply complicated
I hope
question.
not.
And I can't really give you the answer to that straightforwardly, but It's to do with the history of how pipe scales emerged, because what they thought they were doing in the organ reform was looking back to the scales of Schnitger and Silbermann and other great builders from that period and saying, well, what did they do? And actually they struggled to understand exactly what those scaling processes were, but they went measuring all the pipes, and then they started recreating the progressions that they thought those organ builders were using.
Let's go it from the other direction. What was it about the organs at the time then, these late 19th century, early 20th century, call them symphonic organs? What was it about them then that they didn't like? Because to me this sounds, it's all sort of mechanical rather than being informed by the ear.
Those organs, the later organs, the high romantic organs, they're for music which is basically melody-led with accompaniment, either chordal textures or an accompaniment in the left hand and pedal and a tune in the right hand. That kind of melodic idea was something that organ builders played to, especially organ builders like Henry Willis, who made their instruments very strongly treble-orientated. They had a crescendo in the treble to enable that quasi-operatic sound, because the main repertoire that organists were playing at that time was not Bach. It was, Edouard Baptiste or Lefebvre-Wely, which is very strongly music orientated around tunes and bouncy accompaniments. So what organ builders were requested to provide, or what they were providing for music of that era, wasn't the same thing as what Silbermann or Schnitger had been building. And there was a reason for that, and that's because in the old days you could only raise wind pressure by hand pumping. But as water mechanisms, hydraulic mechanisms, gas engines, electric blowers came about, you could blow organ pipes at very high wind pressures. That meant that voicing techniques had to change and adapt, and so the scales of the pipes, the voicing of the pipes, the materials of which they were made, all changed from what had been happening in the 17th and 18th centuries. And if you try to play early music on a later Edwardian or Romantic or High German organ, you find that the music is quite congested. There's no transparency in the musical texture because the pipes are being blown quite hard and firmly and very strongly on their fundamental. And that was really something that the reformers were trying to rediscover in the manufacture of organ pipes. What were those sounds that the earlier organ builders and earlier composers experienced and wrote for?
Well, hopefully you can demonstrate this rather than talking about it, because you've chosen to come to a particular organ. We're at the Servite Priory on the Fulham Road in London, and we're standing in front of a 3-manual mechanical organ built by Grant, Deegans and Bradbeer in 1968. And so 1968, we're talking in England, peak organ reform movement stuff. Why is this organ then for you a good example to illustrate what was going on with this reform movement?
Well, it contains quite a number of the elements which were key philosophical ideas of the reform. First of all, it has mechanical key action. That's the first thing. The second thing is that the voicing style is what we would call open toe. That means there's no nicking in the languids and the lower lips of the pipes, and the toes of the pipe are left quite open.
And this made it chiff, am I right? This is the chiffy sound that people like, but actually that's an invention of this reform movement? This is where we owe that chiffy idea to, isn't it?
Well, it's a characteristic we associate with it, but they thought that they were trying to copy something from earlier organs. In fact, it was more of an invention of the organ reform. It's a bit of a debatable point, but you can hear it quite clearly in these sounds. And the pipes are quite articulated in the way they speak. They have a very definite kind of entry point to the note. And that's not the only characteristic, of course. The voicing style, the wind pressures are low. Instead of having the usual reservoirs and bellows inside the organ, they would have what are called schwimmers, which are wind devices sat underneath the soundboard, which kind of pressurize the air from beneath. So not only are the pipes voiced in a particular way, but they receive their wind really quite promptly, which makes them speak with an energy which not only did earlier organs not have, but Romantic organs didn't have either. So all of these things together, and there's one more element, and that's what we call the work principle, the so-called work principle. And the work is the individual manuals of the organ, and they were all differentiated by pitch. Now, don't forget, when we built organs in England, they were pretty much in a cupboard in the chancel. But these German organs were often built vertically, stacked, the departments stacked one on top of another. So the pedal towers would be down the side, and they would be 16 foot in pitch. The Hauptwerk here, labelled Hauptwerk on this organ, is an 8 foot principal sound. And the Oberwerk is a 4 foot principal sound. And on the Brustwerk, it's a 2 foot principal sound. Now, these are all underpinned, of course, the 2 foot principle, the 4 foot principle, by flute sounds. So the power levels are each similar, but the kind of musical accent that they have is just a little bit different.
What's the point in that then?
Well, the power levels of the individual departments are all very similar, but the differentiation is in the actual character of the tone. It's in the tonal architecture itself.
So same volume, different colour?
Different colour, and that's by the fact that the diapason tone is at a different pitch than the flute tone.
Right.
If I just do it this way, I've got an 8 foot sound, which is a principal, a diapason stop on the Hauptwerk. And if I play that, I can add the stops on top of it. So here comes the principal 8, and then the 4 foot, then the 2 foot, and the mixture. Those are all diapason sounds, all principal sounds, whereas on the Oberwerk, it's a flute first, and then a principal, before we get the mixture.
I mean, whichever way you look at this, it's really complicated.
I think organ building in general is complicated. But if you consider, for example, the English Romantic organ, you have very quiet stops like a Dulciana and a Vox Angelica, and then going up the sort of musical scale, so to speak, in dynamics, we've got the Salitional and a Voix Celeste and a small stop diapason and a Gedacht flute and a violin diapason and a swell diapason and then a small open diapason on the great and then a bigger diapason and then perhaps your number one. And that's a tiered musical dynamic level, set of levels. And the German organ of this organ reform period and these English copies of it, they just didn't operate like that because each of the sonorities on the organ had approximately the same power level. So there was an equality between the stops. And they were sometimes rather ridiculously labelled male and female stops, flutes and diapasons. But if I just illustrate very quickly on the division, I'll pull out each of these stops in turn on the chorus, 8 foot, 4 foot, 2 foot, and mixture. And they all come on with quite a clang. You know, there's no diminishing of the power level as it goes up. So everything on this organ is designed to have maximum colour. So I've got a little Holzriegel here, which is made of mahogany with some metal components in it, but it's got such an incredible sound to it.
when would you use that?
Well, you could use that in all sorts of repertoire. I mean, if you think about the kind of tonality that regals have, I mean, I've just demonstrated a little bit of music which might have been passed off as a sort of fake piece of Tudor music. But there are plenty of repertoire where you could apply a sonority of that nature. Let me give you another example. On the Hauptwerk, there's a crumhorn. And then sounds you just wouldn't have heard on the English organ of the period, very bright flute sounds, 8 foot and 2 foot. We have here on the Brustwerk a Koppelflute, which is a stop of extraordinary construction. Nothing like it in England before they arrived after the classical revival, the organ reform. But the sound of it has got a very quirky character in its harmonic content. And it's very different to the rather smooth-toned Clarabella type stops that we're used to in English Romantic organs.
But the point of that is it's not there to blend, it's there to give the definition going upwards, is that right?
Yes, and to be used in chorus structures of different types. I mean, this 4-foot flute would be an important part of the mixture chorus on the Brustwerk, for example. There are also some different forms of reeds. The English style of reeds was really chucked out of the window when the organ reform came along. You know, the rather binding sonority of the oboe was seen as a thing of the past. And organ builders ordered their reeds from German suppliers. And the sound of them is really rather different. And they are not designed to cap a chorus in the way that they would in a Willis organ, where these choruses of blazing reeds come on, but they very much blend into the musical texture. So these trumpets, they're not the sort of big virile reeds that you might have found, you know, trombas or bright trumpets. And if I put those sounds into the main chorus, let me give you another example. Here we've got an 8-foot sound, a 4-foot flute, a Nazard, 2 2/3. We've got a 2-foot, and then we've got a tierce labelled terz here. Now that of course forms the cornet sonority, a cornet. And those sorts of sounds are a really important part of the 18th century, certainly French and English repertoire, but it does present the player with a really extraordinary array of highly charged musical sonorities, which is almost the diametric opposite of the Romantic organ.
I mean, you can also hear when you're playing it, actually, yes, how immediate and crisp that was, which presumably you couldn't have achieved on contemporary organs when the organ reform movement was in its peak.
And you're reaching to another very interesting point, and that is that the organ reform movement gave rise to a new style of playing. And when we think back to performers like Simon Preston and Peter Herford, they often recorded, especially Peter Herford, recorded on some of the big organ reform instruments in Europe. And some of the playing, a great example is his performance of the Toccata in F of Bach, the big one with the big pedal solos. He plays that on his recordings with an incredible dynamism, which is to do with sort of staccato notes and detached notes, and it has a tremendous driving energy to it.
And that was part of this reform movement, because presumably then he couldn't have played like that unless the organs were built to allow him to do that. So there is a direct influence on this reform movement to influence people like Herford and Preston then.
Yeah, so when you go and translate that musical performing style, that quite quick, very highly energetic, very well articulated style, if you go and play it on those earlier organs, they just don't work like that. The music can't go at that kind of speed. It can't be articulated in the same way, because the actions that were built on these neoclassical organs were much more precise than the older actions.
I mean, can you demonstrate, can you do an impression then of a Peter Herford style performance that this organ, this reform movement will allow you to do?
Well, with apologies to Peter Herford for a start, and what I'm trying to do here is just give you an impression of a sort of highly articulated style played quite quickly using the winding system that's on the organ and the fact that the chorus is very brilliant to give you that very particular aggressive kind of sound.
Well, that shows what the organ enabled performers to do, so they could play like that. But even at the time, this kind of approach was controversial. We're moving away from that. We don't play like that now.
No, I think that's probably fair, but the organ building and organ performance practice goes in phases. You know, these things are trends, and we've reached a point now where that kind of détaché style is considered maybe a bit humorous now, and people are sort of playing Bach in a much more kind of connected legato kind of way. But actually, if you listen to some of those recordings that were made, they are tremendously exciting. Not only do they use very big instruments, but they've got the kind of aggressive speech to the instruments, which is born not only of the voicing style, but also of the winding system. The articulation of the pipes really encourages the players to play in a particular way.
But isn't this the problem so much with things on the organ? This is a little bit, to me, sounding like the tail wagging the dog. It's a sort of a dogma rather than the music.
Yeah, it's always been thus. You know, another bit of dogma is the playing of the organ with your toes. You know, I don't want to get too deeply into this, but there is a book entitled Bach's Feet. And if you read that, it does really come to the conclusion that the idea of playing with your toes only is a bit of another bit of modern invention. There's even an illustration of Bach playing the organ with his heel. And people say, oh, no, that can't be the case. It must be artistic license. But why did they draw him with his heel on the toe? And there's an 18th century tutor by Knecht which shows you how to play with your heels. This is a very complicated subject. When I was growing up, I was told that Bach didn't use his thumb. That nobody wants to own up to ever having said that now, because you can't play the big organ preludes and fugues if you're not using your thumbs.
Well, look, how do you sum up the organ reform movement? Is it actually something that was incredibly disruptive that we're having to fix now? Because when I've gone to organs that are being restored or rebuilt, there's this constant narrative of having to repair things from the organ reform movement, having to fix damage that was made in the 60s and the 70s. Where do you see this organ reform movement? Really, was it an annoying waste of time, or does it have residual value?
It does have residual value for various reasons. And I think you have to differentiate between, let's just say, a beautiful Willis organ of the 1880s, which had a positive grafted onto it. The voicing style, the winding style, none of that belongs to the rest of the organ, so it's a foreigner on that organ. Here we are at the Servite Prior with an organ which was built entirely from scratch. All the elements are new. This kind of organ teaches us quite a lot about what they thought at the time. And if we go through history just continuously rebuilding everything, fine to restore the Willis back to what Willis thought, but I would dread to think that this particular organ would be neutered and made less aggressive and, you know, enabled to play somehow a kind of romantic repertoire on it, because it is what it is. There's a kind of cause and effect. And it's only having gone through the organ reform movement that we've ended up in this cycle coming round where we're looking back at more romantic musical forms. But we've learned a lot in the interim. So, for example, we learned all sorts of different types of flutes, which weren't part of the repertoire before. We learned different kinds of key actions, which could be applied to instruments. And some builders, of course, are still building and fixed on mechanical key actions. Some organ builders, of course, still use continental reed types. You sometimes find so-called Bertoneche or domed shallots in reeds to give them a really sort of French tang to the sonority. And, of course, we're left with a marvellous residue of these mutation stops. And consider this. When Olivier Messiaen encountered the organ reform movement, along with Jean Alain, they started to write music which required not only the romantic sonorities of the Cavaillé-Coll organ. Think of Le Banquet Céleste, that beautiful piece with string sounds and 16-foot bourdon in the manual tone, and in the pedals it's completely devoted to mutation off pitches to provide this very extraordinary drops of water. And you can hardly think of a Messiaen movement of a suite which does not require the sonorities of the organ reform. Now, those romantic French organs sort of blended that neoclassicism, absorbed it, and we're left with an organ which, you know, if you build one today, if you're not careful, you build one which has got so many compromises and it's not actually suitable for anything in particular. And I think what organ builders have done is they've gone back to thinking about a more romantic outlook in terms of tone and the way that sounds blend together, but still incorporating some of the colours of the reform, some of the character of the stops, and certainly some of these mutation stops, and of course building choruses up to mixture work. You won't find many organ builders building an instrument now where it doesn't have some kind of mixture work to complete the chorus.
So really it has its place, but the important thing is take away the dogma and then you're left with really valuable ingredients that people have now fused into contemporary organ building.
I think if you strip away the dogma, which is sometimes associated with performing style and some quirks of organ building, the lessons that are learned out of the organ reform movement actually are very valuable. And I think we should treasure these instruments actually, because all of these instruments from any period in history tell us something about the time and the place and what was thought about music. And if we pass through our own history, continuously altering things to some nebulous aesthetic which we can't pin down, an ever-changing aesthetic, we're always going to be ascribing everything that happened to the bin, the bin of history. And I don't think we should allow that to happen. These are very important instruments.
Well, William, what's a good piece to play that will show this organ in its true voice in representing the organ reform movement?
Well, if you can forgive it slightly tongue-in-cheek, we'll have an organ reform performance of the Choral Stande nicht der Heilige Christ from the Orgelbuchlein, Bach.
William McVicker, thanks very much.
Great pleasure.
Well, I'm outside the Servite Priory now, here on the Fulham Road, and I'm just going to keep walking, because at the end of this road, I'll soon get to an enormous edifice that is the London Oratory, a real masterpiece of Victorian neoclassical architecture. And inside it is another masterpiece of design, the famous 1954 Walker organ, designed by Ralph Downes. Without doubt, the leading light of the organ reform movement here in England. But don't panic. I'm not going to carry on talking about the organ reform movement, because instead I'm on my way to talk to the organist of the London Oratory, Ben Bloor. Because apart from having been the organist there since 2016, he's also amassed quite a following online, using many different social media platforms to showcase the organ at the Oratory, his own work and performances, and to bring a bit of entertainment and diversion to the organ world, with over 350 videos on YouTube, and even an organ podcast. So I'm off to talk to him about how organists can best use social media to market themselves, and if it's now an essential requirement for any young organist starting their career. And while I make my way there, let's listen to Ben playing the organ at the London Oratory with a recording from his YouTube channel, with a piece dedicated to Rafe Downs, written by his friend Percy Whitlock. This is Mr. Downs' Dream.
So I've got a Facebook page for my business stuff. I've got an X page. I tried TikTok for a bit. That's a bit scary and new age for me. I didn't really get on with that. But my sort of bread and butter is YouTube, really. And I think, like most other people, I started recording myself during lockdown. And at the time, I think it was 2019, 2020, I had all these concerts planned for the 24 Pièces de Fantaisie by Vienne, and then the lockdown happened and I didn't get to play them. So I thought, well, I've learned all the music, so I'll record them. And I did, and they did pretty well. And I thought, well, that's quite fun. I'll keep doing that. So I kept going, and I'm sort of about 350 videos in now.
That's quite a lot. I mean, was it just lockdown that gave you the initiative, or would you be of that generation where you're thinking, I do need to have some sort of social media presence for my career?
Yeah, I mean, lockdown certainly spurred it on. I mean, I'm into my 30s now, so I'm not quite that sort of Gen Z, kind of age. But I don't think we ought to be scared of technological progress, and we ought to, embrace it to a point. For me, it's all about sort of putting up music that I've learnt and I want to share with other people. I think when it sort of tips into, look at me, that's when I sort of draw the line, really. So it's, there's going to be some element of your personality in it. But I think for me, and I'm not trying to be all sort of holier than thou, it's more about the music than me.
Ultimately, people will see you. I mean, yes, they might want to listen to, the piece that you're particularly playing, but there might be the more interest in Ben Bloor, who's becoming a bit of a personality by virtue of uploading himself regularly on YouTube.
First of all, I watch a lot of YouTube anyway, just, mainly video game stuff, actually. But I really got into sort of video essays and that kind of stuff. So after uploading some pieces of me playing, I sort of started to think, well, hang on, there's a little bit of a gap in the market for, video essays with topics to do with the organ. And I dipped my toe into that with a series called Chiff Chat. And that seemed to sort of touch a nerve with people. They seem to enjoy that. I mean, for me, it was more the sort of, a good old John Reith of the BBC, the inform, educate and entertain.
But they were light-hearted, though. I mean,
they were, yeah.
So this is your YouTube, you were talking, it was a kind of a YouTube-type podcast as well. I mean, you had a topic. You had to have your personality to do that. It wasn't a dry sort of information bulletin.
True. I mean, as organists, we get a bit of a bad rap for being boring, maybe. I don't know.
You
So
said it,
I don't know. Yeah, I think so. I don't know. I just tried to keep it fairly frothy, fairly light, and yeah, some people seem to find some entertainment in it. But really, I was just looking, and this is why social media is such a fantastic tool. I felt with those Chiff Chat episodes, I could really sort of talk about topics that I really liked and see if other people engaged with them, and that opened up discussions in the comments.
Well, what sort of topics were they, and what were the reaction? Who was the audience you were attracting to that?
I didn't have any particular audience in mind other than, I suppose, people who were already interested in organ music. If it happened to bring in some people who had never seen or heard an organ before, that's great. But yeah, people who already sort of were engaged in that kind of thing. So I could really sort of talk amongst peers, really, even if they were strangers.
And is that something you think you had to do? Because a lot of things that I see, certainly online, are very much aimed at the introductory. They're explaining how organs work. Are you saying that actually you wanted to do something that was more relevant, speaking into the profession?
Yeah, I think I'd get bored myself saying, this is what an organ does, and this is a middle C, and this is an open diapason, and nothing wrong with that. But I think just intellectually for me, just to sort of push myself and see if I could, again, explore topics that are interesting to me, that hopefully I can show off a bit of that enthusiasm on camera. Much an exercise for me as well in sort of presenting and getting a little bit better at that, because as I've said, organists are a little bit sort of insular sometimes. So I thought, I'll put myself out there and see if anything takes off.
And how do you sort of contextualise all of this in your career? Because your substantive role is as the organist at the London Oratory. You also work at Westminster School, so you sometimes play at Westminster Abbey as well. Mm-hmm. You do have a recital career. Do you look at this, and I'm just thinking, is this in the toolbox, as it were, of most organists who have a portfolio career like yours? Is this something you think you have to do, or is it more like a hobby?
I don't think it's necessary. I mean, we're in a digital age now. There's no escaping it. I think you have to be online if you want to be seen. For me, it was just a hobby, really, to be honest. And it's actually grown into something I'm quite proud of. And those Chiff Chat episodes did really well. They took a long time to put together. I'm not going to beat around the bush. I don't really go for the sort of short form content. I'd much rather sort of sink my teeth into a big topic and explore it in every nook and cranny. And I suppose off the back of that, I also listened to a lot of podcasts, and I thought, well, let's try an organ podcast as well. And someone else had the same idea. It seems at about the same time.
Great mind.
I remember ringing you up actually, and we talked about because it was going to come out at the same time, and then my computer broke and yours beat me to it. But no, for me it was just getting some of my mates in a room and talking about organs. So it was a sort of fly on the wall thing. People would listen in and hear two organists talking, and hopefully it wasn't too boring.
But I mean, this is the point, what you're doing. So I mean, you're expanding out. I mean, I know it is time consuming, but you mentioned earlier you had to go at TikTok. Now, for various examples, that's obviously the flagship at the moment for organists to try and be on. What did you find difficult about that?
That's more sort of, as I say, short form content. So you've got to be able to say what you've got to say in sort of 30-second bursts. And for me, that it's just a bit noisy, if you know what I mean. So it's kind of trying to get people's attention within those first couple of seconds. And this whole social media thing, because it's basically a video game, isn't it? You're playing, you're trying to get the numbers and all that kind of stuff. If it becomes a bit about who shouts the loudest, then I don't know, I find it a bit like a sort of marketing strategy, and I find that a bit icky, really. As I say, I'd much rather sink my teeth into something and produce something that I can be really proud of, look back on in a couple of years' time and think, yeah, I could play the organ then, or I could talk about that kind of stuff. That's not to say I don't do the short form stuff. So when I go around to different places doing recitals, I always try to record a little snippet of something, but I make sure I always say something that, for example, I play a piece and I say, oh, this organ's really good at playing this kind of music, or if there's something I find funny, I might sort of put that in. It's never a case of look at me, aren't I great? It's more sort of, here's what I'm doing, this is the music I'm currently presenting in this particular place.
For the very short form, and for things perhaps like TikTok, there's a pressure to be entertaining or even funny. Do you often find you might be being influenced by the tail wagging the dog, so to speak, that you're thinking of, how can I do something on this particular social media format, and then you lose the point of either your musicianship or the point you're trying to make about the instrument?
It's really interesting, yeah. So I often sort of take myself to one side and have a word with myself and say, look, are you what's happening here? What are you doing this for? You know, and just trying to remind yourself why you're doing it. I mean, for my YouTube channel, I actually only play music that I like to play, that not necessarily has the broadest appeal. I think as soon as you try to capture the attention of too many Venn diagrams, it becomes watered down. While it's nice to sort of watch the numbers go up for, you know, my little monkey brain, I just don't want to lose sight of why I'm doing it. So,
but are you chasing numbers? I mean, it must be very tempting because, you know, you are a performer, you are a professional musician. Numbers matter, whether it's the audience at a recital or kind of validating, you know, your online work.
I mean, I'm a firm believer that if you've got something to say and you stick by your convictions and you put it out there, people will find you. I don't think you have to stoop so low just to sort of get the broadest appeal. I mean, I could sort of play the Phantom of the Opera in every concert I do and probably get quite popular and have 10 times as many followers as I currently do. But as I say, then it becomes an exercise in marketing, and I'd rather just, you know, sort of play the music I like, and hopefully there'll be people who find that and jump on board as well.
In one way, I suppose it could still be marketing, because there must be some sort of ulterior motive that's going to be beneficial to you in your career by doing it. Could you point to your career being more successful as a result of having a fairly well recognised online persona?
Yeah, I think I picked up a couple of gigs off the back of it. That's
good.
A nice perk, really. I think if you're posting stuff and expecting it to go viral, you know, if you put a video up and then sort of wait by the phone for a life-changing concert to come in, that, you know, you're barking up the wrong tree. The nice thing about YouTube, there's a really strong community of people who will watch your videos no matter what, and they'll comment on every single one, and that's great. But it's nicer when you get people who wouldn't usually click on that kind of stuff, sort of commenting and saying, "Oh, I didn't know this was around." You know, that's really nice to have seen that kind of thing. So I find that quite edifying.
But I wonder if there's inevitably a kind of a shift as people get more and more fluent and comfortable with using social media. I mean, for you, for example, in your recital career, you won the Northern Ireland International Organ Competition. You're a prize winner in organ competitions in the States, in Canada, in Denmark, here, of course, at St Albans. Do you see a time when actually that kind of thing doesn't matter because you're able to get yourself out much easier by uploading yourself on YouTube?
I mean, the thing I like about competitions is that you're performing at the top of your game against your peers, and you play your best when you're under pressure like that, I believe. I wonder if what you're trying to get at is, you know,
does it help?
Yes.
Are you being booked more because of that, or because people recognise you? So the, you know, bookers might think, oh well, people will turn up to him because, you know, he's got 5,000 people following him on YouTube or whatever.
I think it would be a sad indictment of our times if the people who were getting booked for things were popular on social media and not the people who were really honing their craft and winning prizes in competitions. However, I think that's sort of how it's gone.
But it's a natural reaction, because in a funny sort of way, even though we're talking about uploading organ pieces to YouTube, it's in the realm of celebrity. You'll become familiar. You become associated because people can, you know, watch you on their phone, on their iPad. I mean, this is, you know, everybody who does that kind of thing. That's why it's so infectious, so attractive. So in the discipline of an organ, of professional musicianship, do you think, because you're doing both, you know, you are a prize winner and you are on YouTube, that actually the easy route, and again, perhaps for younger organists who most of their exposure might be on YouTube or TikTok, that actually that is where it might be going?
I mean, I do worry that, you know, well, as we know from any discipline, what's popular is not necessarily what's good. Right, I'm going to get on my sort of soapbox and granddad territory now again. But there's a lot of recitals nowadays where it's just solely based on, you know, film music and music that's not specifically written for the organ. And I just wonder if we're going down a road where people are a little bit embarrassed about, we've got this amazing, you know, legacy of organ music from Bach to Messiaen and everything in between, and it's sort of been moved out of the way for what's popular at the time. And, you know, You may well say, oh, well, it's attracting new audiences, and people are taking up the organ on account of that. But really, are these newcomers wanting to play the organ, or are they wanting to play the theme from Shrek? It's like when you were in school and everyone learned the guitar because they wanted to play Smoke on the Water. I had a friend who was completely amusical who learned Smoke on the Water, and then I said, oh, what are you going to play after that? And he said, well, I don't need to play anything else. I can play that now. I don't know if it's this sort of diminishing returns where we get so oversaturated with stuff that's not real organ music, and I use that term quite deliberately, that we sort of lose sight of what it is to be an organist and what organ music should be. Maybe that makes me a sort of super dinosaur, I don't know, but...
But that said, there's presumably a huge resource of learning, actually, if you're researching performance practice.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's a net positive to have more and more organ content from different factions of organ camps on YouTube every day. I'm very happy doing what I do, uploading sort of classical, in inverted commas, organ repertoire, hopefully to a high standard, hopefully consistently. And, it's been really nice actually with some people commenting saying, oh, I didn't know this piece before, where can I find the sheet music, that kind of thing. So yeah, I think this whole social media thing, it's really positive to be having communities and building links with people who love the organ and people who are new to organ music as well.
And I guess you're kind of influencing how they're playing. So if they're listening to your people wanting to know how to play a certain piece, YouTube is probably the first place they go to now rather than the library.
Yeah, definitely, or how not to play things. I think, if people find creators and performers that they like, they're obviously going to latch on to them. And it's our job, I suppose, to consistently keep producing this stuff that people are going to want to watch. And for me, as we've said previously, it's not about sort of chasing the latest trends, but rather presenting music that I really love in the hope that other people will love it too.
So a young organist starting out, wanting a career, they're fluent on social media, it's part of their life. What would be your advice to them of how to curate and manage their musical side?
Don't expect anything to go viral, it probably won't. Manage your expectations. But I would say, don't put anything online that you're not completely happy with. You can always take it down later, but, nothing ever really disappears from online. So, just put out the best version of yourself. And, if you've got something to offer, people will find you.
And are you kind of stuck doing this? Because, it must be quite time consuming. Do you now feel obliged you have to continue doing this?
I've started recording all my recitals, which... to be honest, it's so second nature now, the inconvenience doesn't even register. But it is a lot of work, setting up all the cameras and recording it all, learning the music, not to mention, and then sort of editing it all together. Is it the most timely thing you do? Is actually your social media activity the most demanding in terms of your time? Look, you could make it a full-time job, and I think some people do. I've got a full-time job, and I don't have time to do all the social media stuff that I probably ought to. I do as much as I can, and hopefully that's enough. But really, you've already mentioned it, sort of tail wagging the dog. You want to make sure that you're doing it for all the right reasons. If you're getting your name out there, whether it be posting 2 videos a week or, a couple of times a year, that's better than nothing. But don't devote your whole life to it.
Ben Bloor, thank you very much indeed.
Pleasure.
Well, that's all for now. Next time, I'm at the famous Father Willis organ at Reading Town Hall, described as the finest Victorian concert organ in the land. And playing it will be Tom Bell, who will be demonstrating how this uniquely preserved instrument can still tell us a thing or two about performing Victorian repertoire. And I'll also be catching up with William Whitehead on the latest developments with his Orgel Buchlein project. So until then, from me, Mark O'Brien, goodbye.